Welcome to episode number 7 of Brand New Cosplay, the series in which I make cosplay. And in this episode I'm going to show you how I primed and painted. Now I did the exact same paint job for all of my armor, so I'm only going to show you what I did to my axe, since that one has the largest variety of details. But let's start with the priming. Now there are two reasons why you want to prime Worbla, and the first one is to smooth it out. Worbla has a little bit of a grainy texture, especially if you stretch it. If you're going to paint directly over it, it's still going to be noticeable, especially if you use metallic paints. So if that's not the type of finish you're going for, you will want to use a primer. And the second reason is for the adhesion of the paint. If you paint directly onto the Worbla, chances are that it is going to chip or scratch off pretty quickly. So there are many different ways to prime Worbla, and I'll leave some articles or videos that compare different methods in the description. But I decided to use wood glue because it's cheap, it's readily available, and it's quite easy to use. For the most part, wood glue self-levels, so you don't really have to worry about brush strokes, and even though you don't need to sand it most of the time. It is also water-based and non-toxic, so you can safely use it indoor and you don't have to worry about any fumes. It also has a pretty short drying time. Now obviously it also has some disadvantages. First of all, it isn't flexible at all. It makes your pieces very stiff. So if you have armor that relies on being able to bend a little bit, this might not be the method for you. It's also quite runny, so you can get some like these little drops within your coat, and it can also smother your details. This can be helped by applying thinner coats, but even then, if you're not careful, you can still get these problems. I decided to mix in a little bit of water with my wood glue so that I was able to apply thinner coats because the wood glue I had was quite thick. I did 2 coats of just wood glue, and this is what it looked like afterwards. Then I went in with wood glue mixed with black acrylic and a little bit of silver acrylic. This way I could apply primer and apply a base coat of color at the same time. It also gives a very durable base coat. Even if the other paint still scratches off, this one will very likely stick. So I did 1 coat of this, and then I did a second coat, but in this coat I made some scratches with a toothpick. This created some actual weathering that was textured and not just painted on. Then it was time for the actual painting. I used 2 different shades of silver metallic, a darker one called graphite and a lighter one called just silver. Now I wanted to have a method that was very beginner friendly, and I found this method that used a kitchen sponge instead of using a brush. Because the kitchen sponge has a slightly rougher texture than actual paint sponges or brushes, it leaves behind this, I don't quite know how to explain it, but it looks very metal-like, especially if you kind of brush with a sponge every now and then, because that really gives this scratchy metal surface type of look. I did 1 coat of just graphite. For this coat I used a tiny bit of water to thin the paint out so that I could get a little bit more coverage. You really shouldn't use that much water with this technique though, because then the texture of the sponge kind of get lost. I also didn't press that hard in gaps so that the black of the base coat would shine through a little bit. Then I went in with a second coat. This time I mixed a little bit of silver in it, about half and half graphite to silver. I didn't add any water at all for this coat. I just went in with just the sponge and the paint, so that this coat would be even less covering than the previous one and you would still be able to see the graphite. I really like the way this looks. It gave a good, interesting textured surface. So after I covered the entire axe with half graphite, half silver, I went in for the shadows. I used a matte black acrylic paint, so non-metallic. And the reason why I like using this for shadows is that it doesn't reflect any light at any angle. If you use a darker metallic color, so for example graphite mixed with some black, then it's still going to reflect light at some angles because it is metallic, and you sort of lose the shadows that you just created. So I applied this at any spot where there could possibly be cast a shadow. This also helps to outline your details and makes them more noticeable from far away. After that I went in with the highlights, And for this I used the same shade of silver, but this time not mixed with any graphite, and I used it out of this pen. This is a paint pen, so it paints on acrylic paint, and I managed to find it in the exact same shade of silver. Again, the reason I use silver and not white, if you use just white, it is a matte finish, and what you get is that at some lights it will not reflect light while the metallic around it will. So instead of having a highlight, it will look like a shadow. So I did this around all of the raised edges, mostly around the shadows, and I also did this on the edges of the spikes in the middle. Now here I was having quite some trouble with the pen, which was strange because I didn't for all of my other armor pieces, but this was a slightly thicker one, and I think I'd had left it out overnight, so the paint was slightly dried up inside of the pen, but I did manage in the end. So then it was time for the weathering. The first thing I did was color in all of my previously made scratches with black. So here I use a permanent marker with a fine liner tip, which made it a lot easier. For the previous ones I had used just acrylic paint and a detail brush, but that was really a pain to get all of the scratches colored in. Now it looks kind of strange with just all of the scratches, and I do think I might have gone a little bit wild with them because it looks like a cat detected. But in order to make it look slightly more realistic, I added even more weathering, and I did this by adding smears of black, silver and graphite. It might sound strange that I'm using lighter and darker colors, but if you think about it, when metal gets scratched, at first it's going to be very bright because the dirt has been scratched off as well, so it's left with this clean layer of new metal. But then as time passes, there will be some dust that gathers into it and it will actually become dark. So what I did, I would just dry brush it on with a sponge, and every now and then I would use the rougher side of the kitchen sponge in order to make even harsher scratches. If I thought they were too harsh, I would smudge them out again, and I would also smear them on top of some of the scratches in order to make them less obvious. And this was the final step for the painting. I sealed my paint job with spray varnish. This is, I think it's called satin finish. It's like in between a matte and a glossy, which in my opinion is always the best finish for metal, unless you're going for a super shiny metal, then you could want to use a glossy one. Now some of the other things that had to be painted were the straps and the leather around my axe. For the straps I mixed a lot of water into some black acrylic, and then I painted it onto the straps and wiped it off where I thought there was too much. This gave all of my straps a little bit of a weathered look, so they didn't look as clean and new. And then for the leather wrapped around the axe, I added some shadows underneath all of the edges, so that the texture would stand out a little bit more and be a little bit more noticeable. However, this isn't super important since I hold the axe at this point, so it's not going to be visible most of the time. And this is what the paint job looks like on all of my other pieces. I'm actually quite happy with the way it turned out, since this isn't something I am super experienced with. As I said before, I'm very critical when it comes to my own work. Quite often I end up throwing my pieces away before I even get to painting because there's something about them that bothers me and that I don't quite like. But for now, I hope to see you for the next episode.